Hi, my name is Ava Hathaway Hacker, and I'm a student at Yale University studying history and history of art. I worked on the historical research for the Declaration of Sentiments exhibition at the Institute Library's gallery upstairs. And today I'm going to talk you through some key moments on the timeline of American suffrage that I made for the exhibition. The timeline begins in 1789 with the U.S. Constitution, and it ends in 1975 with the revisions to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The U.S. Constitution in 1789 allowed each state to determine who could vote. Most states restricted voting to white land-owning males. If not in 1789, then shortly after. For instance, New Jersey restricted its suffrage formally in 1807. The 1800s and the decades before the Civil War saw a rise in activism around the issue of abolition. 1837 marked the first anti-slavery convention specifically organized and run by women, and both white and African American women were in attendance, though discrimination and issues around travel to the convention not faced by the white female members meant that not many were actually able to attend the convention. One of the convention's organizers, Adelina Otero-Warren, articulated the importance of African American women being in attendance, saying that, "It is all important that we begin right, and I know no way is likely to destroy the cruel prejudices that exist as to bring our sisters in contact with those who shrink from such intercourse." The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was the first women's rights convention. It was held in Seneca, New York, and key organizers included women who had become very prominent within the suffrage movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. There, the organizers presented the Declaration of Sentiments, the namesake of this exhibition, a document modeled on the Declaration of Independence, replacing, however, Jefferson's condemnations against the tyranny of England with their own against the tyranny of men. Taking the first lines of Jefferson's document, they declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." This crucial change, the inclusion of women into the purview of the Declaration, highlighted the subtle but explicit exclusion inherent in the original text. The Declaration of Sentiments set out 18 inequities faced by women, and along with them, measures that would help rectify this injustice. The most revolutionary of the demands contained in the document was the call for female suffrage. The Dred Scott v. Sandford decision in 1857 put in place the inability of African Americans to be U.S. citizens until this was overturned by the 14th Amendment. In 1834, Dred Scott, a slave, was taken to Illinois and Wisconsin Territory, both places where slavery was not allowed, before being taken back to Missouri. He then sued his master's widow for freedom in 1846, and in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that Scott could not gain freedom from this, and that African Americans could not be U.S. citizens. During the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, many of those who were involved with the suffrage movement turned their attention solely to the cause of abolition. After all, many women who were prominent within the suffrage movement had gotten their start as and still remained passionate abolitionists. In 1866, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a prominent abolitionist, suffragist, and author, gave a speech at the National Women's Rights Convention. Here, Harper sat on the platform with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and in her speech, she voiced the uniquely oppressed situation of African American women and her fear that the white women of the suffrage movement did not understand these issues or care to address them. Her words certainly reflected the movement for female suffrage as it existed at the time of her speech and had existed since its beginnings, but her words also seem particularly prescient given the divisive schism soon to come within the suffrage movement and the racism inherent in that schism. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified. This granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and thus gave citizenship to former African American slaves. The proposal of a 15th Amendment that would declare that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude divided the women's suffrage movement. One group of women, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, rejected the amendment, essentially due to their belief that white women should be given the vote before African American men. Stanton and Anthony would form the National Women's Suffrage Association, and in the years to come, partner with the explicitly racist Democratic candidate George Train, and even engage with blatant white supremacists. The language of their rhetoric would often have a decidedly racist spin. On the other side of this schism was the American Women's Suffrage Association, formed by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, which supported the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, though discriminatory laws were put in place to bar African Americans from voting even after they had the right to under federal law. This brings the timeline up to the late 1800s. In 1879, Suzette LaFlèche testified in Standing Bear v. Crook. LaFlèche was a prominent advocate of Native American rights and the oldest daughter of the last recognized Omaha chief. In 1877, she went with her father to the Ponca tribe, which had recently been forcefully relocated, and there she witnessed the injustice committed against them. She subsequently acted as a key witness in the ensuing case, Standing Bear v. Crook, and the outcome of the case was crucial for Native American rights, as the judge ruled against the U.S. government's argument that Native Americans were not people under the U.S. law, and decided instead that they were, and this meant that they were owed rights, including that of due process. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act forbid the immigration of Chinese laborers, and also barred Chinese nationals from becoming American citizens. 5 years later, the Dawes Act of 1887 would give the federal government the ability to divide tribal lands in order to claim the land to sell and force Native Americans to assimilate. Only Native Americans who detribalized could receive U.S. citizenship, essentially attempting to force assimilation. But amidst the racism and discrimination so prevalent in the U.S. at this time, the last two rulings I mentioned, a couple examples of that, activist groups were forming to fight for change. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was founded, when the National Federation of Afro-American Women and the Colored Women's League merged. Mary Church Terrell would become the association's first president. And in 1904, the National Association for Colored Women became the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. The motto of the organization was "Lifting as we Climb," taken from a speech by Mary Church Terrell herself. The women of these clubs knew that they faced a complex set of obstacles not faced by either male African Americans or white women, and they sought to achieve intersectional goals that would lift multiple causes up as they climbed, in the words of their motto. In 1898, Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the NACW, gave a speech to the National American Women's Suffrage Association. While this was after the schism between the two women's suffrage organizations had ended and the two groups had merged again, into the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the racism and discrimination that had led to the schism were far from gone from the movement. In her speech, Terrell implored the organization to help work against the discrimination faced by African American women, articulating that African American women were not only, quote, handicapped on account of their sex, but they are almost everywhere baffled and mocked because of their race, end quote. Suffragist parades became a popular way to promote and draw attention to the suffrage movement in the early 1900s. In 1912, Mabel Ping-Hua Lee, on horseback, helped lead a suffragist parade in New York City. Lee was born in China and moved to New York City in 1905. She graduated from Barnard College and went on to receive a PhD from Columbia University, becoming the first Chinese woman to do so. Lee was only 16 at the time of the parade. Of course, as a Chinese immigrant in a time when Chinese immigrants could not naturalize and gain citizenship, Lee would not have been able to vote even with the passing of the 19th Amendment 8 years later. The Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913 was a huge event, with floats, thousands of women in attendance, and taking place the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. On March 3rd, the parade, organized by the National American Woman Suffrage Association, took place on Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C., and main organizers included Alice Paul and Lucy Jones. Ida B. Wells, a prominent suffragist, civil rights activist, journalist, came to the parade with the Illinois delegation. She was asked to march at the back by white suffragists, but she refused. More than 40 African American women marched with their intended sections within the parade, including Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the NACW. And Native American suffragist Mary Louise Bottineau Baldwin also marched in the parade with the section from her law school, the Washington College of Law. It would only be 7 years after the 1913 suffrage parade that sex would be removed as a barrier from the vote, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Though female suffrage had been proposed as an amendment, it needed to be ratified by at least 36 states. Adelina Otero-Warren was instrumental in New Mexico's ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. She was a prominent activist in New Mexico, and in 1917, she became the leader of the New Mexico chapter of the Congressional Union, a suffrage organization. In addition, in 1922, Otero-Warren was the first Latina to run for Congress after winning the Republican nomination, though she lost to the Democratic candidate. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1920, declaring on a national level that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. However, removing sex as a barrier to the vote did not, of course, mean that all women in America could vote. At the time of its passage, Asian American female immigrants and Indigenous women explicitly still could not vote as they were not allowed citizenship, and discriminatory laws created restrictions on African American women voting despite their citizenship. Racist barriers to the vote also barred many Latino women and Asian American women with citizenship from enfranchisement. The 19th Amendment was a crucial moment for suffrage in removing the barrier of sex to the vote, but to treat it as the end of the fight for female suffrage is blatantly false. The timeline continues past the 19th Amendment to show the obstacles and opposition and successes in working to make the 19th Amendment actually apply to all women in America. For instance, it wasn't until 1924 that the Indian Citizenship Act passed, which granted citizenship to Native Americans. However, because individual states still held the power to restrict or grant suffrage, some Native Americans would not be able to vote for decades to come. In 1926, Sakala Shah founded the National Council of American Indians with her husband. The organization worked to advocate for Native American rights, and she served as the president of the council until her death, working to gain the vote for Native Americans across the U.S. who were still barred by the restrictions of individual states on suffrage, as mentioned before. In 1951, Harriette Moore and Harry T. Moore were murdered by a hidden bomb in their house. The couple had organized the Brevard County chapter of the NAACP, and Harry Moore became leader of the Florida chapter of the NAACP. He also created the Progressive Voters League of Florida to advocate against African American disenfranchisement. The couple's murder was, of course, directly tied to their civil rights activism. The bomb exploded on Christmas morning, 1951, which was the couple's 25th anniversary. The civil rights movement is, of course, crucial to the history of suffrage in America, as advocates championed equity and justice for African Americans in this country, working against the immense racism and discrimination pervading every aspect of society, including, crucially, of course, the right to vote. The Selma to Montgomery marches in 1964 were 3 protest marches that took place along the highway from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, as part of a larger voting rights campaign. Despite the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which had forbid discrimination or segregation on the ground of race, color, religion, or national origin, those attempting to register African American voters in the South faced serious resistance. The march began in response to the murder of Lee Jackson, who was peacefully protesting, and the marchers faced violent attack, including a vicious assault known as Bloody Sunday. Following the Selma marches, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned voting discrimination based on race. It forbid various measures that had historically been used to disenfranchise African American voters, including literacy tests, for instance, and the act also put in place federal examiners to register voters. Before the end of 1965, there were around 250,000 more African American voters registered. When thinking about the history of suffrage and the history of disenfranchisement, it's really crucial to think about felon disenfranchisement. A key case related to this happened in 1974, Richardson versus Ramirez. So here, the Supreme Court ruled that disenfranchising those who have been in prison even after their sentences end is not unconstitutional. And this decision, combined with the historic racism of the judicial system, means that today a disproportionate number of African Americans of voting age are disenfranchised, roughly 1 in 13 versus 1 in 56 for non-African American voters. And today, 4 states still disenfranchise anyone who has ever been in prison for any reason, even after they complete their sentence. This brings us to the final event in the timeline, the 1975 revisions to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The 1975 revisions provided greater rights for minority groups in America, including Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Hawaiians, Native Alaskans, and Asian Americans. These groups often faced discrimination within the voting process due to English literacy requirements. And the revision also ruled that voting materials had to be available in translation in places with large numbers of non-English speakers. In so doing, the revisions expanded the work of the 1965 Act in working to eliminate more discriminatory barriers to the vote. So this is the final moment of the timeline, though it could, of course, continue past this date. Ultimately, this timeline aims to show that the struggle for equal suffrage in America is not a movement with a start and end date, but a weaving path with victories and obstructions, one that has existed for centuries and certainly continues up to today. Thank you so much for watching this video on the timeline. If you'd like to see more of the Declaration of Sentiments exhibition, you can visit the Galleries page on the Institute Library's website, where you can find a slideshow of and more information on the exhibition as a whole.